Dr. Sebastian Joseph was talking about the Center for Historical Studies, one of the things that was inculcated in all of us as students and also then later as faculty is the importance of the collective. The collective doesn't mean that we think alike, that we speak alike. In fact, let me assure you, we have such serious differences. We had such serious differences amongst us that were historiographical and that were also positional. So historiography is the broader issue, but within that also there was a positional difference. So as a Marxist feminist, I could disagree with someone else who would take a Marxist position and so on. So we in historiography tend to label as if these labels are very finite, very fixed, but that is not the case. There are ways in which conversations happen. There are those points where we find that the methods as well as the analysis don't really depart significantly. So it is with that kind of an understanding of what a collective means, the respect for the historian's craft, the upholding of historical methodology, and the providing of space for solid research. That is what we had sought to do. Our founding scholars at the Center for Historical Studies, Professor S. Gopal, Professor Bipin Chandra, Professor Satish Chandra, and Professor Romila Thapar tried, and this is something that was passed on through generations, and I possibly belong to the last of that generation that actually carries it. But I think the great thing about such ideas, such visions, is that it doesn't matter if JNU is destroyed, because let me assure you, we are being destroyed. We are being attacked in terms of, it is very emotional for me to talk about it, but in terms of the curriculum that is being pushed down our throat, in terms of the admissions, the new admission policy where through the combined university admission test, the eligibility test, the CUET, students are being brought in. It is being destroyed through the faculty appointments. So we are looking at the complete demolition that is being attempted towards an institution that has forged the idea of excellence in historical scholarship and also the need for collectives. And that is why I appreciate and stand with the Kerala History Congress for all that it has been trying to do over the past 10 years. Now, a few days ago, on Monday last, I was the victim of a cyber crime. Somebody hacked my phone, and it really threw me, it traumatized me even. But as I was thinking about how to frame what I would like to speak about today, I was thinking about how this phishing of my phone, this hacking of my phone, is happening at a social level in India. This hacking is happening at an institutional level in India. And unfortunately for us, it is a state-backed, state-sponsored hacking that is happening. And we shouldn't claim innocence when we look at what is happening around us. We cannot say that we are apolitical. I am only a historian. I only look at sources. Yes, I am a historian of ancient India. I don't really study modern Indian history or contemporary Indian history. But I cannot claim that I am oblivious to it because our functioning is being affected. We do not get research funds. We do not have the space to invite people. You know, in my School of Social Sciences, we had a seminar that was planned around Bhagat Singh. And so the broad theme, the broad frame was to look at revolutionary movements. And there were people from Ireland who were going to speak. This was supposed to be a hybrid mode seminar. We had scholars from Ireland, from other places who were supposed to be a part of this. At the last minute, there was a diktat that was given asking us to cancel this event. Now, maybe this happens in other contexts as well, in other institutions as well, but the manner in which the spaces within an institution like JNU that has stood quite fearlessly, really, on many issues, not just in the campus, but across Delhi and across India and also internationally, where students and faculty have taken stands. That space is shrinking is something that is quite disturbing. So I've titled my talk, Disciplining History, Challenges, Distortions, Fabrications. I wish I could add that our responses, our strong responses are also there, but we also have to face this reality that the voices that are speaking out are not as loud anymore, right? And there are few forums like the Kerala History Congress where this is possible. We have formed another collective. Young scholars in Delhi have formed a collective called the History Collective, and they organize an annual conference called the Delhi History Congress, where again, we have a space, but within institutions, where we are told that we cannot have a conference on Bhagat Singh and revolutionary movements, where we are told certain scholars cannot be called. For instance, a colleague had called Saba Naqvi, whom many of you might know, a well-known journalist, and there was a show cause notice against the scholar. So these are the ways in which we need to talk about, we need to publicize, we need to shame, and we need to stand up against this kind of browbeating and bullying that is taking place all around us, because it has ramifications for the way in which the discipline itself is to be taken forward. And I think over here, an issue that I think is important for us to keep in mind also is about the responsibility of the historian. I will come back to the point that Professor Devika raised about Ranajit Guha's wonderful essay on the death of Chandra. And it was by Ranajit Guha. And I'll come to that in a little while, but the point that I want to make is that the responsibility of the historian in the way in which we pose our questions historiographically, and what could be the ramifications of that. As someone who studies religion, I do focus on goddess traditions, goddess worship, as was mentioned by Sebastian. And one of the core reasons for my interest in the study of the goddess was the very contradictory way in which Indian society thinks of the feminine, looks at women. And I'm talking about largely the Brahminical society. And on the other hand, there is this veneration of the feminine principle. That contradiction, how does it come about? Why does it come about? Is it uniform? Is it, a monolithic construct that we are looking at? Can we look at the divine feminine as being understood in multiple ways? And for understanding that multiplicity then, Do we need to look beyond the Brahminical? Do we need to look at the folk, the local, the regional, and so on? So these were the questions that really led me to the study of goddess traditions, and that really threw up very important issues for me, because as a scholar of ancient Indian history, one is always bound by the sources. And what are those sources? They are largely Brahminical sources. So when I look at those sources, how do I read these other elements that would go into the making of a syncretic tradition, if we would like to call it that, a synthesized tradition, which is drawing upon multiple diverse elements and coming up with a goddess tradition. I think that we have all, traversed a long path, those of us who study religion, and moving with D.D. Kosambi, who says that particularly when we study mythologies, we can see that in myths, there are those points of conflict, contestation, that would be the indicators. Those are the indices that we need to look for, through which we can see how traditions which are quite different, quite disparate, are being brought together. Right? So in terms of methodology, it requires one to be very careful in the reading of the source. And of course, as Mark Bloch said, or E.H. Carr also for that matter, it is not a virtue to be honest to your sources. You are meant to do that as a historian. And that is why we will critique those who do not show that honesty when it comes to sources. That is where they are not those we will consider historians at all. But when we do look at these sources, then we can't take them as presenting a truth, an infallible truth. We need to read that source in context, and all of you are, scholars and researchers, and I'm sure you're very familiar with these kinds of questions. But the reason why I was bringing this up is that of late I find that scholars seem to be losing sight of that responsibility when we frame our research questions. Yeah? When, while we might historiographically argue and disagree with when Hinduism was invented, when you actually title your book as the prehistory of Hinduism, as the invention of Hinduism, and so on, maybe it is the market, your publisher also is pushing you towards having these catchy titles. But ultimately, for the historian, it's not about just the publication per se. It is about being responsible even in the title, from the title to the content, and the publisher. Every part of it is equally important for us. So I think that responsibility is something that we all need to think about. And we have all faced the kinds of issues that Professor Devika mentioned, where publishers tell you that they are not going to publish because a reviewer said this or that. In the volume on goddesses that has been edited by Dr. Malavika Binni, Dr. Megha Yadav, and myself, we had to really argue with our publishers about some of the essays, because the fear of our publisher was that there is going to be a right-wing attack because of the way in which questions related to sati, questions related to the casteism that is intrinsic to certain forms of worship, and so on are there in the book. So we actually had to fight, we had to argue. There were long explanations with references that had to be given to defend our position that we will not back out of this. So this is one of the important things for us, as historians. We cannot wash our hands off this responsibility also that we have. Now, there is this discipline called history didactics that I wasn't very familiar with, but have been reading more and more in this field, which tells us about how to advance history teaching while also focusing on questions of representation and the way in which history mediates in society. This is one of the things that the panel on cinema, history and society yesterday was seeking to address. Yeah, the question of representations of history, of society, and the way in which history gets implicated and imbricated in the way in which a society perceives itself and its past. Now, the research that we take up as historians has to be opened up to the larger society, of course. But we also need to find specific ways in which we are able to communicate this. This is what the scholars in the field of history didactics have been arguing. And one of the problems that they have encountered, and I'm referring to the work of Suzanne Popps, who has written extensively on this, but one of the interesting points that they raise is the idea of the national textbook. How to come up with something called a national textbook. And largely the context is Europe, and it is in the context of the end of the Cold War, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the unification in Germany, and then the way in which communist governments in Central and Eastern Europe collapse. So this is broadly the context in which she's talking about the issues that we as scholars face when we think about textbooks. Can we have national textbooks, right? And can we have something called a national memory and a national historic identity? Because these became some major questions in these many European nations. And what happened in those contexts was obviously there was a clash. There were certain historiographical positions, there were certain historiographical narratives and lenses through which the past had been studied. And there were also revisions of those positions that had occurred. For instance, one of the revisions that was very interesting was about the Ottomans. Now, the kind of study of the Ottomans in the 18th and 19th century, it was a very colonial view. And the Ottomans were vilified. There was no, serious discussion of the nature of the state, the nature of society and economy. It was typical of the colonial discourse, talking about the Ottomans as these predatory, as this predatory state that went and attacked and governed other states and other regions. And so as invaders, as marauders, as predators, this was the narrative that, that had come up really largely in the 19th and 20th century. And when serious scholarship began to integrate this understanding, then within certain contexts, for instance, Greece. In Greece, there was a great furor that was raised by the Greek Orthodox Church as well as by the state. So the state also comes in to support the church. So this is one of the examples that is given by Pop. And another very disturbing example that she draws our attention to, which may have slipped the attention of many of us, is in 2005, in France, a law was passed where it was stated that all school textbooks should talk of French colonialism as something that was positive, that had resulted in some positive developments in the colonized context. There was a big outrage against this, both within France, in many colonized countries, places that France had colonized. And finally, this was repealed. This law was repealed in 2006. But just look at the enormity of it. It's a law that was passed. Yeah, you know how frighteningly close we are to that. That is why I'm drawing attention to this. Yeah. Other ways in which conflicts in the present, which may have a history in the past 100, 200, 300 years, how they get pushed in a certain way to some kind of historical memory. That is also something that's very interesting. So there is this instance of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City that was bombed in 2001, September. And the Pentagon also was attacked. And we know that the Twin Towers were fully destroyed by these two airliners that crashed into it. Now, shortly after this incident, the US President Bill Clinton, in a speech he gave at Georgetown University, made this very strange historical reference. I'm quoting him. When the Christian soldiers took Jerusalem in 1099, they proceeded to kill every woman and child who was Muslim on the Temple Mount. Contemporaneous descriptions of the event describe soldiers walking on the Temple Mount with blood running up to their knees. Clinton viewed the passing down of this event through stories still being told today in the Middle East as leading to the heavy price that the Americans had to pay because the Americans were seen as symbolizing the Christian West. Bill Clinton is saying this. Yeah. Now, the colonial and imperialist control over West Asia, from the 18th century itself, we see the way in which things were developing. The political interference in the region, where in the 20th century, modernizing governments were overthrown, where dictators were propped up, and then warlords were militarized so as to topple the dictators. Right? These have all been part of the West's strategic mechanisms to control the region. But all of this is elided in Bill Clinton's statements in his lecture at Georgetown University. Today, of course, we are all, standing a little helpless in the midst of the terrible genocide that has been carried out in Gaza, with legendary history of a promised land that is posited, where the colonial history, so that is the justification for the way in which, and of course the Holocaust, for the way in which the Israeli state, the Zionist state, is being supported by all the pillars of democracy across the world. And the colonial history before and after the Balfour Agreement of 1917 is not at all brought into the discussions. Yeah? So these are the ways in which history is used, it is distorted, it is fabricated. And as historians, do we just sit back and say that this is not our concern? I would strongly urge you that we do not have that luxury. Because if we do that, then soon we are not going to be able to carry out any research at all. Because something or the other will be objectionable to someone or the other. Now, coming closer to home, just 3 days ago, newspapers in India reported that our Prime Minister on 25th November 2025 had stated that, and I'm quoting him because I don't want to be misquoted, the hoisting of the Dharma flag at the Ram temple in Ayodhya on Tuesday was the culmination of a 500-year resolve to uphold Indian tradition, and it has healed the centuries-old wounds. Now, this is a blatant distortion of historical events, which had gained, so there are elements of this that had gained traction in the colonial period itself, and it became the bandwagon for the communalizing Hindutva forces from the early 20th century. And this has, of course, already been popularized through WhatsApp histories and so-called, the new histories that are being written. And what has happened now is that there is political validation from someone no less than the Prime Minister of this. So on the one hand, we know the background from which he comes, but on the other, he's also head of state. So there is an official position from where something like this is clearly sending a signal, right? So what is happening over here? That's some great wound going back to 500 years. And let us remember that the actual judgment of the Supreme Court on the issue of Ram Janmabhoomi, on the destruction of the Babri Masjid, was that while there is no concrete, reliable evidence, I don't have the exact quote, but to just sum it up, that because there is a belief, this is something that was accepted, that a temple is going to come up here. And it is only later that Justice Chandrachud, the former Chief Justice of India, said that, that there was evidence. Now, where he came up with this evidence, maybe it came in his dream again. I don't know whether it came in his dream in the first place, but so anyway, so we know that this is a very a territory, a space or a ground made of quicksand, because there is really nothing to hold that argument. And but yet this idea of a 500-year-old trauma that people have had, this is something that keeps coming up. So essentially what is happening is that you are trying to negate the Mughal period completely. But our Prime Minister doesn't stop over there. A few years ago, when he was in France, he stated that it's 1,000 year. 1200, his math is wrong. He could have said 800 years, but I thought I had read 1,000. But anyway, whatever, that it is from the Delhi Sultanate. That is what he meant, that India has been colonized and that colonial yoke was thrown out and so on, only in the modern period. So this is something that is very much there. So negate the Mughal period, negate the Delhi Sultanate as really being part of Indian history. So when he says in this statement that it is the upholding of Indian tradition, and again, let us think about those who represent the state that is supposed to be based on the constitution and constitutional values, on secularism, on democracy. The governor of Uttar Pradesh, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh were also standing next to our Prime Minister when these statements were being made. So what we have is very clearly the state itself coming out with this kind of a very blatant position on what is Indian tradition. It is not anything that has to do with Mughal history or the Mughal period or the Delhi Sultanate period. Something else that was said by the newly minted historian who occupies the highest office in our country is that, I quote, The slave mentality, ingrained in people by Macaulay's Minutes, had deprived generations of information about the prevalence of democratic governance in ancient times. The greatest misfortune is that Macaulay's impact was widespread. We got independence, but we were not free from the inferiority complex. A thought was instilled that everything from abroad is good and our own things are full of flaws. Because of this slave mentality, it was ingrained in us that we took the concept of democracy from abroad and our constitution is inspired by foreign countries. Unquote. Now, there are many things that are being said over here, and just for a small clarification, he refers later then to the Uttaramerur inscription, which talks of democracy in ancient India. Now, this inscription is a 10th century inscription of the time of Parantaka Chola, who ruled from 907 to 955 CE. And what does that inscription say? There are inscriptions in Uttaramerur before Parantaka and after. What does this inscription tell us? Firstly, what is Uttaramerur? It is a Brahmadeya. It is a Brahmana settlement. Okay, we know that the Brahmadeyas and the Devadanas were created as socio-political and economic institutions in different parts of South India, and particularly in Tamil Nadu from the Pallava Pandya period itself. And in this Brahmadeya in the 10th century, we are being told in the inscription that there were 30 Brahmanas who would be elected or who would be representing the Brahmadeya in the Sabha. Now, how were these Brahmanas to be represented? There would be olas on which their names would be written, right? Now, and also that there would be 30 segments into which the Brahmadeya, the settlement, would be divided, and from there it was supposed to be, in a sense, representative. But was it? And what would happen? So, conditions for eligibility is that you had to be of a certain age, between 35 and 70. Yeah, you had to have certain wealth and so on. But very interestingly, it was said that amongst the disqualifications, somebody who hung out, who cohorted with lower castes, was not allowed to be a part of this, right? And there were other things also then that are there as part of the inscription. So there are qualifications and disqualifications that are mentioned. Then what happens? You have on the olas, you have the names of people that are written and they're put in a pot. No? And then a child, apparently a male child, a Brahmin boy, would be asked to come and pick out a chit. And the chits would be picked up. So actually it is not representative. How do we know that it's 30 different segments that are, we don't know actually. We don't know if there were 30 pots with, that kind of detailed information we don't get further. But nevertheless, what we do know is that it's actually a lottery system. It is not election. It's a lottery system. Somebody is saying, I'm eligible, nominating himself, and someone comes and picks out one chit and that's it. You're elected. Democracy. This is the democracy that is constantly being raised. I mean, they are greater historians than us. So, well, but anyway, coming back to the issue of the constitution coming from outside, that it is not really our constitution. I had an email on the day after he made this statement that was sent in the name of the Prime Minister, telling us that was Constitution Day, Samvidhan Divas, and 26th November 1949 the Constitution was adopted, so that has been designated as Constitution Day. And he tells us how a person from a humble background like him could rise up only because of the Constitution. Yeah? Just look at it. The previous day he says, let me reread that statement. Because of the slave mentality that was ingrained in us, we took the concept of democracy from abroad and our constitution is inspired by foreign countries. You know, very schizophrenic if you ask me. But at any rate, to come back to this issue, I'd like us to think a little about how this idea of the constitution has been critiqued by the RSS in 1949 itself. There was an article in the Organizer which said that we don't accept this constitution. Somebody who was one of the key ideologues of the RSS, called Dinanath Batra, he headed the Vidya Bharati, which runs the RSS school networks across the country. He also founded the Shiksha Bachao Andolan Samiti and the Shiksha Utthan Nyas, and he was responsible through his lawsuits and mobilization for the pulping of Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus and Alternative History, and for the removal of A.K. Ramanujan's 300 Ramayanas. These were flagged by the Chief Minister of Kerala yesterday, Mr. Pinarayi Vijayan. And this was actually, the work of Dinanath Batra, who was known as a very litigious person. He kept filing cases on various things. Now, he authored a book in 2001 titled The Enemies of Indianization, Marx, Macaulay, and Madrasas, in which the attack was on Western educated Marxists and liberals, on Christians, and on Muslims. Yeah, that they were anti-Indian, anti-national, and you can see Western educated is one part of it, but Christian and Muslim, just by the fact of them having these religious identities, they were anti-national. Now, Batra, incidentally, was also one of those who petitioned to remove Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, from textbooks, school textbooks, Premchand, the great Premchand, and also M.F. Hussain, that mention should not be made of great artists of contemporary India, like M.F. Hussain, because these were all anti-Hindu and anti-national. And M.F. Hussain was not even mentioned in the main text of the textbook. It was in the things to do, where the teachers had to ask the children to go online and look at the paintings of specific painters and so on. It was that, even that. No, if they go there, they might see the wrong things because this is an anti-Hindu guy, an anti-national guy. Yeah. So this is a rhetoric that is very much part of the RSS ideology, that no English, go back to the past, yeah, and that Hindu is India, yeah, that being an Indian means that it is essentially a Hindu identity. Now, attached to this then is the way in which a very clever usage of decolonization has been doing the rounds with the Hindutvavadis, right? They constantly talk about how we need to decolonize these Marxists, these leftist historians and all. They are the ones who are perpetuating the colonial mentalities and so on, right? Now, on the issue of language, I think it really doesn't even warrant a discussion, but the attack on English as an elitist language is brought in. I myself, and even in Kerala, in Trivandrum, I have had this thrown at me that, you speak in English, but I'm going to answer in Malayalam, or I'm going to speak in Malayalam. Nenu kuda Telugulo maatladochandi. Naadum Tamilla pesala. In a multilingual society like ours, in a heterogeneous society like ours, we cannot dismiss the issue of the kind of language that we use to communicate, but it has to be a calibrated response. It cannot be a gut level response. It cannot be a unilateral response. That is the problem over here. And here I'm reminded of Mahmood Mamdani's substantive discussion on the need for decolonizing in African universities. where he argues that rather than forsaking the university system as an incubator of Western modernity, what we need to do is to work from within, to subvert and to critique the issues, the interpretations, the conceptual frameworks that lead to the privileging of what happen to be Eurocentric narratives. So he compellingly posits the intellectual quest has to be both local or regional and global. Just talking about throwing out the colonial language is not the solution. Secondly, the argument that is often made is that English creates a hierarchy, and that going back to our mother tongues and pre-colonial knowledge systems presents an alternative. It creates a more egalitarian space. Yeah? And so you also have the casual statements that are made by the political class against the Lutyens, people, various ways in which elitism is branded and in a negative way and is presented. So you have those kinds of statements that are made at the popular level, and that in a more serious way, if at all you can call it serious, because I was watching TV debates after the Prime Minister made this statement, where apparently people teaching in institutions are saying things like this, that there's this elitism, there is a hierarchy that is created. Oh, in pre-colonial India, we didn't have hierarchy, we didn't have class system, we didn't have caste. Caste, of course, is a fabrication, by the way. The NCERT textbooks, Dr. Tintu Joseph has done a brilliant paper on this in a work that we are going to publish very soon. But in that, he shows how the NCERT textbooks, blatant lie is being presented to school children. That caste was basically a way of organizing society. It's the British who came and distorted it. Okay? So, the way in which this idea of an ideal society, a Ramarajya, where there were no differences, where everybody was equal, this is a blatant historical distortion. And I think here also the way in which women across classes and castes had only limited access to what was considered real knowledge. It's not that women and men who were deprived of Brahminical knowledge didn't have knowledge. They had their own knowledge systems. Certainly, a Tachan, a carpenter, a smith, various others, they have their own knowledge systems, definitely. But then look at the cunning, where the Shilpa Shastra, where possibly the knowledge of Shilpa is coming from the practitioner, it gets rendered in Sanskrit, where the Shilpins themselves are distanced from their knowledge. Right? So we do have, therefore, a serious question to ask. When we say let us go back to our earlier knowledge systems, clearly what is being suggested is Sanskritic knowledge, Brahminical knowledge, to which we have to go back. And I mentioned the article in the Organizer on 30th November in 1949. It says, in our constitution, there is no mention of the unique constitutional development in ancient Bharat. Manu's laws were written long before Lycurgus of Sparta or Solon of Persia. To this day, his laws, as enunciated in the Manu Smriti, excite the admiration of the world and elicit spontaneous obedience and conformity. But to our constitutional pundits, that means nothing. Unquote. The invocation of the Manusmriti as a text exemplar by the ideologues of the RSS, of Hindutva, including, let us not forget, the attempts at introducing Manusmriti in college and university curriculum. In Delhi University, it was almost passed. And then because of so many protests, this was withdrawn. This is indicative of what was hinted in that speech on 25th November. So that borrowed, shameless slavery and so on, when talking about the constitution, instead what should we have? Something to be very proud of, the Manusmriti. Right? So let us look at the Manusmriti to understand what it is all about. Now there are 12 adhyayas in the Manusmriti. The first two dealing with studentship, with then the next 4 chapters from 3 to 6 dealing with marriage and the household, the rules governing food, the rules governing family life, the rules governing the end of family life, and so on. So there's a whole range of things that is mentioned over there. Adhyayas 7 to 10, which talk about laws and punishments. And then the last 2 adhyayas, 11 and 12, which talk about the penances and actions that had to be taken. Right? Now, firstly, let's understand what this Manusmriti is. The Manusmriti is a text that was composed sometime around the 1st century BC to 1st century CE. Some people will push it from 2nd century BC to 2nd century CE. So, broadly around that time period when a dynasty in North India called the Shungas were ruling. Yeah? We place it towards the 1st century CE because of certain references that are there in the text, like the mention of gold coins, like the mention of China. By the way, this is an interesting thing for us to think about. The term China appears not in China, but it appears here. When we keep saying Indian name versus foreign name, not Indian name, indigenous name versus foreign name, because Indian is foreign, according to this logic. Yeah, the China actually is the colloquialization of the Qin dynasty. Qin dynasty, I think. I don't know how to pronounce it. And it is from there that it goes back to China and it becomes common in circulation. So China calls itself China. I don't think there are any debates really. At least I don't know of them. Now, what do we have further in the Manusmriti? Manusmriti is the first of what we will call the Dharma Shastras. It's a major treatise which is talking about regulations, rules, and norms that have to be upheld in state society. That's what the Dharma Shastras are. Before this itself, you have the Grihya Sutras and the Dharma Sutras, which are enjoining upon people, which are prescribing for people how they should lead their household life and live within society by performing certain kinds of rituals, by behaving in certain ways that conforms to a socio-cultural structure or socio-cultural order. Now, the Dharma Shastras are going further. They draw upon the Dharma Sutras, but what do? They also say that these can be the basis for the enforcing of law. They don't call themselves, by the way, law books per se. They don't call themselves. Manu actually is a very interesting text. It's easy for us all to attack him, and we should attack the Manava Dharma Shastra for many things. As historians, we are a little more empathetic when we look at a text. It's a source. So when we look at that source, what we find is many contradictions are there. So the text says, for instance, on marriage, that you cannot marry outside your Varna. It gives importance to the Chatushvarna system and Varnashrama Dharma and says you should not marry outside the Varna. But the Brahmin can marry a Kshatriya woman, a Vaishya woman, and a Shudra woman. It's not acceptable, it's not ideal situation, but you can do it. But a Shudra man, he cannot marry anyone above him. Yeah. So severe penalties have to be imposed on people who transgress like this. This is what he's saying. But then when we come to the part on laws and punishments from Adhyaya 7, you find that strange. Manu is saying there are children who are born of a Shudra man and a Brahmin woman also, of a Shudra man and a Kshatriya woman also. So there are contradictions within the text. As historians, we look at these as indicating that you can have prescriptions, but it's not necessary that everybody is conforming to it or following what is being prescribed. And then you also have, even on the question of knowledge, what is Manava Dharma Shastra saying? The first two adhyayas, the second adhyaya in particular, it is saying that the guru has to be a Brahmin. And the Dvija, that is the Brahmana, the Kshatriya and the Vaishya, can be initiated. Yeah? They can have initiation rites. So Upanayana, up till there you have this. Now it says that women also can be initiated. But in the initiation rites, the men have to chant with the priest. The priest will lead them and they will also chant. In the case of women, women are not allowed to chant. Right? What it also tells us is that, you want me to wind up? What it also tells us is that nobody can gain knowledge through illegitimate means. In other words, what is illegitimate? If you hide your caste, or, you don't hide it, but you don't tell your caste. Right? So, what the text is very clearly doing is laying out rules on how to order the Varnashrama Dharma in society. And then it says that during times of distress, there's a term called Apad Dharma. Yeah? During these times, then you can have a Shudra also as a guru. Right? But you should only have him as a guru for a small time period. Don't stay with such a guru. Otherwise, for the Brahmin, it says you must forever stay with your guru. Don't ever disrespect your guru and so on. Huh? So it's in that sense that we find that Manu is really, making a lot of very important or giving us important insights into the kind of social order that is envisaged. Now, when we look at the way in which gender is talked about, it's in the sections, in the chapters on marriage that we find women talked about. And you should see the descriptions of women. It's primarily the upper caste that is being talked of, but the way in which it's talked about a red-haired woman, woman with large breasts, with a big body, with slim waist, small hips, all these you shouldn't marry. Okay? And it's like our advertisements even today. You go to any matrimonial advertisement, it's more or less the same. We never have these things for men, but it's always for the women. And then, of course, this verse, which we all know, sums it up so well. Pita rakshati kaumare bharta rakshati yavane rakshanti stavira putra na stri swatantrayam arhati. Right? So she doesn't have any independence. She's always constantly dependent on father, husband, son. Well, this is something that is laid out there. But one thing that is very important is when we do talk about caste system, we should also understand we are not talking only about Varna. We are talking about Jati also. And Romila Thapar has argued that we can look at these two, Varna and Jati, as emerging separately. That Jati might even have a pre-Vedic and non-Vedic origin, and that it is only from the end of the later Vedic period that the two concepts of social ordering are coming together. So that is why it is in the Jati that you have endogamy and other rules that are very strictly enforced. Right? Nevertheless, there is a broader understanding of caste in that Varna Jati conceptual frame, which has been referred to as Manuvad. And we see that caste takes on a new character In different time periods, in the early medieval period, we have a proliferation of jatis as shown by R.S. Sharma. In South India, in the Tamil South especially, we have not a horizontal differentiation, but we have a vertical segmentation. We have the Valangai and the Idangai, the left hand, the right hand and the left hand castes that are there. These are the broad paradigms within which we have caste differences that are brought in. So whatever, there are different regions, it takes on different forms and so on. But nevertheless, Varna as a ritual status and ritual ordering, and Jati as a way of locating a caste, locating a group, and the curtailing of mobility within the jati or of the jati is something that we do see across different regions. There are inscriptional texts, there are textual sources and so on which are telling us about this. Now this Manuvad that I was talking about is something that actually gains momentum in the colonial period, because it is in the colonial period that, so in that sense they are right, not to say that it didn't exist earlier, but this very modified, uniform way in which the caste system was being understood, with Manusmriti as the reference point, where Manu himself is saying that don't go by just what is written in this Shastra. He's telling the king, you have to go to the local area and see what the local caste formation, the social requirement is. And accordingly, then the penalties and the enforcing of law should take place, right? So there is that variability that is there. But what happens is that creating this unified sense of caste is something that we do find, more prominent in the colonial period. It's not that the Brahminical society did not attempt to do this earlier, but here it appears that it is from the colonial period that Manusmriti as the text that talks about caste is there, and so it is both critiqued by academics, Dalit scholars, feminist scholars, and so on, as well as glorified by the ideologues who see Indian society as a Hindu society. Subhashini Ali, in a lecture that she gave on Manuvad ka dimag mein pravesh, talks of how the legitimizing of caste and gender inequalities and oppression, while it draws its inspiration from Manuvad, Manusmriti, it is being reinforced and it is being reframed and recast, particularly in modern times because of the new media that is available to us. Look at the way in which people are bringing back, especially upper caste, bringing back caste names. Look at the way in which certain kind of ritualism is coming back, and these are becoming public rituals. Yeah, we are, in North India, we are now celebrating, we have holidays for Chhat Puja, we have holidays for something else. So these are regional, festivals and celebrations and so on. But they are very much within the Brahminical frame, and they are being invoked, they are being propagated, they are being given a public space. So when Subhashini Ali talks of Manuvad ka dimag mein pravesh, she is talking about how already through various media there has been a resurgence of caste, and may I add, which she did not, gender inequalities as being natural, as being intrinsic to Indian society, and it's something that we have to embrace. And it is in this sense that I think we need to call out the invocation of the Manusmriti as a constitution that we need to bring for modern India. It goes against our secular values, it goes against our democratic values, it goes against the vision of the anti-colonial struggles, it goes against the struggles for equality and dignity. And that is why then, as historians, it is not enough for us to stop at just talking about the Manusmriti and so on, but we actually need to enter into these debates to say that no, sir, the Manusmriti cannot be the basis of modern Indian society. Thank you.